This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Prof. CJ of the Dangerous History podcast. We're going to discuss a very interesting bit of history from the 1970s and 1980s through the lens of the movie American Made, starring Tom Cruise, released just in 2017. We will discuss a wide variety of topics from the proxy wars in Central America to the drug wars, Iran-Contra, and much more. And so thank you very much for coming on the show today, CJ.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's great to talk to you.
Before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your show, the Dangerous History podcast?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've been teaching college history since, I think, 2006. And I started back in 2014 a podcast called the Dangerous History Podcast, and you can go to dangeroushistorypodcast.com and find it on all the usual podcast venues, iTunes and so forth. And I've always really been interested in the kind of dark corners of history that are neglected by a lot of the typical mainstream coverage of history. It leaves out a lot of what I think is the most interesting stuff. And there's a lot of history that's hidden in plain sight, and it's easily found in a library or these days online, but just nobody knows it. So I would share those sorts of things with my classes, within the context of like an American history class or whatever. But ultimately, I decided I wanted an outlet where I can really just dig into all that stuff. So my show covers all sorts of different time periods and topics. And I always try to kind of dig up the things that people just don't know.
Yeah, that's why I really love your show. It's when you get into those pieces of history where you're like, wow, that really happened. It gives you a really different perspective on how things went down.
Yeah. A lot of the things that I cover are things that, to the average person who's never encountered any of these things might strike them as like bizarre conspiracy theories. And I always say that I don't deal in conspiracy theories. If there's something that's not proven, I'll maybe mention, oh, there's a rumor of blah, 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 but I can't prove it, so who knows if it's true. But the thing is, there are so many things out there that are not theory anymore, where things have been exposed one way or another over the years, that you don't need to be a theorist to have all kinds of bizarre and sometimes funny and sometimes disturbing stories about some of the darker things that have happened.
And I think we're going to get into quite a few of those when we discuss this movie.
Yeah, this movie is definitely right up the alley of a lot of the sorts of things I cover on my show.
So as I said, this movie was released in the latter half of 2017, and it stars Tom Cruise as the character Barry Seal. We'll get into him in just a moment. The film isn't directly based on a book or on a particular source. It's a fictionalized story about true events. And interestingly, it's directed by Doug Lyman, whose father, attorney Arthur Lyman, was chief counsel for the Senate's Iran-Contra investigation. And also, there was a lot more in this story about some connections between the CIA. Can you maybe get into just a little bit about this production? Even the production of this movie has some interesting twists and turns.
Yeah. Well, I tried really hard. Two things that I tried to dig up in preparing for this show that I wasn't quite able to nail down. One was I was trying to see if I could find floating out there on the internet anywhere a copy of the original script. Because, sometimes you can do that. You can find just out there posted somewhere as a PDF or whatever, an original script, because as I'm sure lots of people know, very often the original script for a movie and then what ends up actually being the final script and getting made as the movie are often very, very, very different. And in this case, the original script was actually entitled Mena, a reference to Mena, Arkansas, which is where Barry Seal eventually makes his headquarters for his smuggling operation. And the name of the writer escapes me, and I forgot to jot it down. But the original script, from what I've dug up, I haven't been able to find it, but I found some articles and things talking about it. And the original script was more about the overall operation itself and focused more specifically on like the CIA's involvement and all that. And the final script what was actually made into the movie, that's there, but that's not the focus as much. And instead, the actual movie is more focused on Seal's personal story. So the focus is different. It's not as focused just on the sort of smuggling Iran-Contra angle, though that's part of it. And also, from what I've found in the original script, they supposedly showed more direct contact in various ways between Barry Seal and both George H.W. Bush and between Barry Seal and Bill Clinton. So there are a couple of quick scenes where this is brought up, and they do, give little allusions to it and things, but they apparently, the original script had a lot more of those kinds of scenes, including, by the way, there was originally going to be a scene where Barry Seal actually meets with Bill Clinton in person, and Clinton at the time is getting a lap dance, and that scene obviously didn't make it into the film. And I'm not sure, why did they reduce the amount of showing, contact and perhaps complicity between Seal and both the Clintons and Bushes, when there's a fair amount of evidence out there to show that there was a lot of, maybe not always personal face-to-face contact, but a lot of, people kind of helping protect Seal for a number of years while he was doing his thing. And it's possible it could be to limit how much the film negatively depicts the American political elites. Like, they're willing to do a little bit of it, but not too much. I don't know. It also might potentially have been because of legal worries that if they depicted too many scenes of Clinton and or Bush helping out this dirty smuggler, that, because those are ex-presidents who are both still alive, that, I don't know, maybe they'd face some sort of legal issue, something like that. And just one more thing, interestingly, I think anyway, because who knows how the movie would have been, but I believe when the script was originally sold, Ron Howard was going to make the film. And then obviously it ended up being Doug Liman, but who knows, how different of a movie it might have been if Ron Howard did it. Now, on the other topic that you raised, the topic of, was the CIA itself involved in actually the production of the movie in some way? I wasn't able to find a clear answer. I did my best, and sometimes you can find this. Sometimes they admit it. This is something that I've been getting more into lately, in maybe the last few months or year or something. I've really come to realize that the amount of direct and indirect influence that the Defense Department and the CIA have over Hollywood movies is huge. And I kind of knew it was there, and I knew it was a thing, but it's like bigger and deeper and more profound than I had ever thought when I really started digging into it. So the CIA and the military in the United States have what they call entertainment liaison offices, or ELOs. And what these offices do is, and that they're heavily connected to Hollywood producers. The people who work for these offices, they rub elbows with top Hollywood people all the time and go to parties and things. And what they do is they offer movie makers things like the ability to shoot on a military or CIA facility, or providing technical consultants and expertise to try to make the movie more realistic, or the action scenes more compelling. And of course, a big one, particularly for the military, is they can provide expensive hardware to actually be in the movie. If a Hollywood director had to actually bring in a bunch of stealth fighters to fly around in his movie, first off, it'd probably be impossible, but even if he could rent them somewhere, it would be so expensive that it would never the movie would never be profitable. But the military can do it on the taxpayer's dime through the ELO. So, what the military or the CIA will do is they'll say, hey, we'll help you out with your film. We'll provide all this production added value to your production. But of course, there's always strings attached, and the strings are basically, they have to approve the actual content of the movie. And there are cases that have been exposed where the military or the CIA is like literally leveraging movie makers into rewriting their scripts. And so my question in trying to figure this movie out was the CIA in any way involved in the production of this movie? And like I said, sometimes it's open. Sometimes it's literally, it'll be in the credits, or, even on like the CIA's own website, they might mention, that they were involved in making some movie. And sometimes it's not, though. Sometimes it's not above board, but one way or another, it later comes out. There have even been some cases where the CIA never officially acknowledged working on some movie, and little things like in the director's commentary version of the DVD, one of the directors or something will actually say, "Oh yeah, by the way, we have the CIA guy in here who was helping us to shoot this scene," or whatever. So, I mean, sometimes whether by accident or whatever, they do kind of let it slip. But anyway, so the point is that sometimes they're involved in the movie above board, and sometimes they try and keep it under wraps. There's also cases where filmmakers will bring in consultants who are, former CIA guys, which might as well be about the same thing. So anyway, I tried really, really hard to find out, couldn't find any direct proof that the CIA was involved in this production. But one thing that's interesting is both director Doug Liman and the main star Tom Cruise have both previously made films that we know without question the CIA was involved with the production of. So, for example, Doug Liman made The Bourne Identity. Bourne Identity, the CIA helped out on. And Tom Cruise, of course, made the Mission Impossible films, which also the CIA was involved with. So, I can't say for certain the CIA was involved in making this film, but the fact that the director and the main star have both made hugely successful Hollywood movies where we know the CIA was involved means that it's, certainly not impossible or even implausible. And I just want to say, like, people, when you look into how the military influences Hollywood movies, it's in a way it's more simplistic. When the military, the actual, the Defense Department, and the individual branches of the military, when they consult on a film, it seems like what they do is just kind of like try to make the film depict the military in a positive light, and it's very kind of like simplistic what they do. They'll demand changes to the script, like if there's a scene where a military officer acts really badly, they'll be like, "Oh, let's make this a good character instead," kind of thing. For example, they rewrote the first Iron Man movie somewhat so that it was a bit softer in criticizing the military-industrial complex versus the original script. But the CIA has actually been involved in making movies that depict the CIA in kind of a complex light. So someone might look at this movie and go, the CIA is shown as being these kind of, shady criminals almost. Mm-hmm. Why would the CIA potentially be involved in making a movie that depicts them like that? And it just seems like they're okay with sometimes having themselves portrayed in a morally ambiguous or even you might say morally negative light. They seem to be okay with it based on the number of movies they've been involved with making that show them as being kind of shady. And who knows what their motive is for that, but they're more sophisticated than the military is with this thing. Maybe they're doing it to try and intimidate people that, like, look how badass we are, or maybe they're doing it to try to intrigue and recruit the right sorts of people to want to join the agency. Who knows? And the other possibility here, if there is CIA involvement, is that it could be what they call a limited hangout, which is where when something negative gets exposed to the public, oftentimes the relevant agency or group or whatever that's implicated, they'll actually volunteer part of the truth in order to kind of distract people with that, and thereby kind of by default conceal other parts of the truth that might even be more problematic. So this concept of a limited hangout, I think, sometimes is a factor as well, when it's gotten to the point where they simply can't deny certain shady things in their past, and so instead they kind of hang a lantern on it, but do so in such a way that the whole truth doesn't come out. So anyway, that's kind of what I've come up with. I don't have any solid answers for sure about this movie, but it does seem a little bit suspicious in a few ways.
Now, the setting of the movie is in the mid to late 70s to about the mid 80s. There's a lot of things that this movie taps into, namely the Iran-Contra situation and the Colombian drug wars and drug leaders. Can you explain a little bit about what was going on with those situations?
Yeah, I'll try. It's real complicated. But what's happening is that the United States is doing something they've been doing throughout the Cold War, but it's amping up in certain countries of sponsoring anti-communist movements. Now, in countries where there's kind of a right-wing anti-communist government already in place, the U.S. is sponsoring them during this time period with guns and money and training. There was the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, operating at this time. I think it's still in operation, but they changed the name, if I'm not mistaken. And that was to train the security forces of like right-wing Latin American regimes to fight against communist insurgents, or alleged communist insurgents in some cases. It's questionable how much they really were communists. But anyway, there's also in a country like Nicaragua, which in the 1970s, Nicaragua was taken over by the Sandinistas, which I don't know if they officially call themselves communists, but they were, pretty far left socialist, and they certainly seem to have been friendly with the Soviets. And so the U.S. government in that case, where the government's actually socialist or communist, the U.S. government then sponsors insurgents. And in the case of Nicaragua, these people get known as the Contras. So they're fighting the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua, and the CIA is helping them out. And during Ronald Reagan's first term in the early 80s, Congress passed something called the Boland Amendment, which said the U.S. government can no longer offer any financial or material support to the Contras in Nicaragua. So what ended up happening was the Reagan administration, of course, very staunch anti-communists, their National Security Council makes the decision to, and this is where people like Oliver North and so on get involved in kind of this clandestine operation. Their National Security Council decides that they believe that supporting the Contras is so important that they're willing to, quite literally break the law that Congress had just passed, and that I believe Reagan himself had actually signed the Boland Amendment, to subvert that and figure out a kind of around the obstacles, backdoor, secret way to keep funding and equipping the Contras. So apparently the CIA facilitates cocaine smuggling into the U.S. and then later also sells arms to Iran, which, of course, was an official enemy of the United States at the time and really ever since the late 70s. And then this money is used to then run guns into Nicaragua to supply the Contras. So that's kind of like the simple version. And another good companion with this movie to kind of introduce someone to this concept who's unfamiliar with it is the movie Kill the Messenger, which is about the reporter Gary Webb, who in the 1990s dug up some stuff. And in his case, there were kind of, during the days of running coke into the U.S. in order to fund the Contra War, there were sort of like two wings of the operation. And Barry Seal was one of the main players in the East. He's running stuff into Mena, Arkansas, into Louisiana, into Florida. And then there was the operation in the West, largely running stuff into California. One of the main players there was a Nicaraguan named Danilo Blandón, who was a major importer of cocaine into the west coast of the United States. That's where the famous South Central Los Angeles crack dealer Freeway Ricky Ross made a name for himself as kind of like the retailer of all that stuff. But anyway, that's going on. And at the same time that this is happening, and there's a long history, by the way, this might sound outrageous to someone who's not familiar with the history, but there's actually a long history of the CIA in various ways cooperating with and helping and protecting certain drug operations. And you can read a book, for example, like The Politics of Heroin by the historian Alfred McCoy to start to get a sense of how long this history goes back. But basically, the CIA has a history of being more than happy to work with people like mobsters and drug cartels during the Cold War, in order to fight communism. Of course, it often, as the movie depicts, it often gets very, very hazy as to how much of these operations is about really fighting communism versus how much of it is just about, people trying to make a buck. But there's a long history of the CIA being quite willing to work with major criminal organizations when they believe it's in their interest to do so. So at the same time that that's all happening, then you also have in the United States the war on drugs, so-called, which really began under Richard Nixon as like a major priority. And of course, Reagan amped up the war on drugs in the 80s. So the same government that is cracking down harder on Americans for buying and selling and using illegal narcotics, and increasingly is, putting these stiffer sentences in place that get us to where we are today with the world's largest prison population in the land of the free. The same government that's doing that, a part of it at least, is also facilitating the drugs getting in here in the first place. So it's really, really, morally problematic when you look at it. And it shows you how complicated things are, where at the same time that the DEA is trying to fight the war on drugs, you have the CIA and other elements of the government facilitating the importation of drugs. So, and at this time that the movie is set, of course, the major source of the cocaine was the so-called Medellin cartel, one of the most famous drug cartels ever. The series Narcos on Netflix is pretty much all about it. And this is where you have the Ochoas, and you have Pablo Escobar and some other really famous drug kingpins. They set up this cartel out of Medellin, Colombia, and they then make just absurd amounts of money. I mean, it's hard to even wrap your head around how much money they made. And so that's the primary source of cocaine from the latter 70s through the 80s until I forget exactly when, might have been early 90s. But eventually the Medellin cartel gets successfully taken down. Of course, Escobar gets killed and everything. And then what happens is a new cartel simply takes its place. I think it was the Cali cartel that came in next. So that's the historical context, is this shady intersection of drug dealers, CIA people, kind of right-wing clandestine groups, and this weird fusion of smuggling guns and drugs, and all in the name, allegedly, of opposing communism in the Western Hemisphere.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. So that really is a very complicated history that we're diving into here. Let's first just look at the character who's the main character of this movie. They streamlined his life story a bit to make a little bit more straightforward movie of Barry Seal. He led a lot more complicated life than what we get through the movie. Can you tell us a little bit about his life? Because it definitely starts way before just being a simple TWA pilot.
Yeah, there's a lot more to his story, and certain points, I think it's pretty clear that they left out or they changed for the sake of making a Hollywood movie. You have to simplify things, like you said. And then there's certain points where I wonder, things that maybe it wouldn't have taken much to elaborate a little bit more on in the movie that were left out. And, who knows, it might have what the motivations were for those sorts of things. But Adler Berryman Seal, known as Barry Seal, lived, I believe, from 1939 to 1986, when he was gunned down, as the movie shows, while doing community service. And there are a lot of things that are either left out or that were changed. Some of them are, not crucial to the overall history. Some of them at least seem kind of important to me. So just to run through a few things, the movie portrays him as very much, despite his career, as being kind of a family man, really. And he was not. He had, I think, over the course of his life, 3 different wives. And I don't think, as far as I know, I could be wrong, I've not seen pictures of all of his wives, but as far as I know, none of his wives was a super hot, smoking lady like the wife in his movie. Barry Seal was involved with clandestine operations, probably with the CIA, much, much earlier than the movie shows it starting. And he was also involved with serious smuggling much earlier than the movie shows. One thing the movie gets right is that Seal, by all accounts, was a very charming guy. He was one of these sort of, charming rogue kind of characters. And that's portrayed, I think, pretty accurately. But on the other hand, he was not a slim, good-looking Tom Cruise guy. He was actually an obese guy, not particularly attractive. And I think that probably the late James Gandolfini would have been, had he still been around, James Gandolfini would have been the guy to get to play Barry Seal in the 1980s. Because if you look at a picture of what Seal looked like in the 80s versus James Gandolfini, it's pretty darn close. But the movie showed Seal quitting TWA Airlines in, I think, 1978, and then going to work for the CIA in a front corporation flying over Latin America. And the reality was he was actually fired from TWA in 1972 because he got caught smuggling explosives in Latin America. Literally tons of explosives he was smuggling that were ultimately going to be used against Castro's government in Cuba, which clearly looks like a CIA operation to me. And I mean, it's hard to believe the CIA wouldn't have been involved in some level with this operation, given that it was running Operation Mongoose type stuff against Castro through that entire time period. So this shows you that he was more involved in smuggling, more involved in the clandestine world much earlier than the film shows. And in fact, there's evidence and rumor that he was involved in these sorts of things going way back to the 60s or even the 50s. Also, prior to 1978, Seal had already made a fair amount of money by smuggling in marijuana and had already bought multiple airplanes to smuggle with. And 78 was simply the year that he switched to cocaine to make more profits. So, there's this whole bunch of stuff that they leave out. And the film, it briefly mentions that Barry Seal was in the Civil Air Patrol in the scene where the CIA guy is recruiting him. They briefly mention he was in the Civil Air Patrol, but they don't really get into more of that because there's actually a very interesting story there that we can maybe return to. But there's a long trail of Barry Seal being connected to lots of really shady, known CIA type people and clandestine people. The film doesn't mention that Seal actually got repeatedly busted over the course of his smuggling career. It didn't just happen once or twice. And that the bust that actually caused him to then have to work for the DEA wasn't the big dramatic bust at Mina that the movie shows, although that's a wonderfully funny and dramatic scene where, 4 different law enforcement agencies all come to bust him at once. But in fact, it was a bust in 1983 for smuggling Quaaludes into Florida that got Barry Seal kind of coerced into working for the DEA, trying to pin the drug smuggling on the Medellin cartel, but also trying to implicate the Sandinistas as being involved, which was basically not true. But overall, the movie, to me, kind of portrayed Seal's involvement with smuggling and with clandestine operations in an almost kind of Forrest Gump-like way. He's sort of like this average dude. As of 1978, he's this average dude. The worst thing he's doing that gets him on the CIA's radar is he smuggles a few Cuban cigars in, and that's it. And then he kind of like unwittingly stumbles into this whole world and gets in over his head. But again, in reality, he was really plugged into all kinds of criminal and intelligence related stuff going way back.
That was an interesting part of the movie, that he clearly had a history of CIA involvement, that it wasn't just a CIA person tosses him keys to a high-tech airplane and says, go for it. Do we know much about how the CIA operated in those types of operations, if you will? They sort of portray Schaefer as a middleman cubicle dweller who's getting into this situation. Is that how it would have worked, just as one connection to the CIA, or was there more to it?
Yeah, I think there would have been not just one guy, because the way they portray Schaefer, who's of course not really based on a real character, the way they portray Schaefer is he's like almost rogue. He's like on the edge of going off the reservation. And there even was a deleted scene where he was getting kind of chewed out a little bit by a supervisor because the Contras weren't fighting very well or something like that. But the overall way that they depict that is is accurate in general to how these sorts of things seem to have worked, where, and this is what makes it so tricky when you're researching this to try and figure out, what the CIA is really doing and what's just, theory or rumor or whatever, is that the CIA has always been, going all the way back to its beginning, has always been very happy to operate in these hazy zones where a lot of the people actually doing things for them are not actual CIA employees and they basically subcontract out, and they absolutely do the sorts of things that are shown in the movie, as far as they'll set up a fake front corporation and they'll hire people who are not direct CIA employees to kind of do shady things for them on their behalf. There's lots of cases of this sort of thing coming to light that we know it is how they work. And so there's oftentimes like certain people, when you go back and look through the history of these kinds of characters, and you run into people like Guy Bannister, like David Ferry, like E. Howard Hunt, lots of other shady people. And it's amazing, during this time period, they generally come from either Texas, Louisiana, or Florida for some reason. These sorts of characters who are not direct CIA employees, but who are like up to their eyeballs in CIA operations, that definitely, the overall concept of the CIA doing that sort of thing is something that has a lot of clear historical examples to back it up.
We'll probably get into this a little bit more as we progress through the episode, but I think it's valuable to talk about it now. There's a lot of different layers of agencies going on in this movie. He has interactions with the local sheriff in Mina, which we'll talk about in a moment. But then when Barry Seals finally gets busted, there's the DEA, the Arkansas State Police. I think the ATF was there. Was it a situation where there was they clearly in the movie show that there's no coordination amongst all these agencies. Did the DEA and the ones who are fighting against the drugs have an idea that the CIA was actually working counter to them?
Yes. There have been people both from DEA and sometimes from various state and local law enforcement agencies who over the years have come out and basically said that, where, they were conducting very successful drug operations against some particular ring, and then either, right before they're about to bust somebody, they're told, hey, this person is protected for national security, go look at someone else. Or cases where, people do get busted and then either just get let off the hook entirely, or they get some sort of slap on the wrist that's like not typical for, like a major drug smuggling offense. So yeah, there have been substantiated cases of people saying just that. And even I think John Kerry's Senate investigation of the drug angle of a lot of this stuff, it was either late 80s or early 90s. It actually, in its report, said something along the lines of that certain people were kind of given a pass in drug smuggling. They were protected, essentially. And what that seems to have meant, that people were often told, like, oh, it's because of national security. And what that seems to have meant essentially was, oh, this person is someone who's on the CIA's do not disturb list. And that's definitely realistic. And also, as to the question about the different agencies of the government not always being on the same page and often working at cross purposes, that's also absolutely true. And I mean, going way back, the CIA has long had a very antagonistic relationship with the FBI. That's well known and well documented, that they often work at cross purposes to each other, and they don't share information with the other one, even though it might be something important that actually does have to do with like real security. That the same thing is true in regards to the CIA versus the DEA once the DEA comes along, and that the FBI and the DEA have a long history of not cooperating, and that the ATF has a long history. Like, they all kind of, it's sort of like the same rivalry you find between the different branches of the military, as far as part of it's just, everyone's sort of a snob for their own agency and its interests. And also, to some extent, they see each other as rivals for the budget. They see each other as rivals for prestige and for, acclaim and promotions and all these sorts of things. So, yeah, that's definitely true. And, you can imagine how if you're a slick criminal who knows how to play these rivalries and things, as Barry Seal did for a while until he eventually ended up with no friends. But, it definitely provides an opportunity. And you find a similar thing, like if you look into the Gary Webb story about the California side of this story, where DEA and Los Angeles County and city law enforcement, oftentimes they'd be closing in on a particular person. And if it was kind of a protected guy, they would either be diverted from the case, or if they did bust somebody who was protected, again, the person would be like let off without anything really happening.
Let's get into Mena, Arkansas. That is where Seal sets up his base of operations towards the part of where this movie is happening. He's originally from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I believe. Then he moves to Mena, and Mena's very interesting where it's geographically located. It's right smack dab in the middle of nowhere in the Ozarks, but it's a pretty short hop to about 5 or 6 major U.S. cities. Why was Mena, Arkansas picked, and was that a decision he made, or was it an arrangement with the CIA?
From what I've been able to dig up, I mean, we don't know for sure exactly kind of who made the decision, but some of the people who've really researched deep into Barry Seal's story say that it was basically his decision to make Mena his headquarters, and that, the CIA was okay with it, and obviously they continued during that time period to support him and protect him as long as he, helped them out in their Contra operation. And so it seems like why he chose Mena was, number one, it was in a different state from his home state of Louisiana, because by then he was kind of pretty well known to Louisiana law enforcement and that sort of thing. And they seem to have been, starting to zero in on him. So move to a different state, and at least it throws off some of the heat. And then, like you said, I mean, it was a very, on the one hand, it's remote, but it's central to a lot of major places. It's in the middle of nowhere, but it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And, there was this little airport there that he apparently did purchase. The notion that the CIA kind of just bought it on his behalf and then just gave it to him, that seems to not have been accurate. But the overall idea that he goes there and then kind of, owns this airport and then ends up owning huge amounts of real estate and businesses in the area. And all of a sudden, this sleepy, tiny little backwoods, impoverished town, right? I mean, the film shows when they first go to Mena, it's like almost a ghost town. And then within a few years, like there's tons of really successful banks right down the middle of the street in Mena. And, there's all kinds of money flowing into the town. That's all accurate, that happened during those years. And it is also accurate that Barry Seal began to, how much of this was directly done by his operation and how much wasn't, I'm not sure, but for certain, it's true that some of the Contra fighters began to be shipped up to Mena, Arkansas, where, not only is there the airport, but there, like they said in the movie, there's, thousands of acres that were owned by Seal, and started to use the area as a training camp within the United States for the Contras. Again, all at a time when this is illegal under the Boland Amendment. That's accurate. So that part of the film is more or less true. The effect this had on this little middle of nowhere, sleepy Arkansas town. And there's an interesting story that the film never mentions. And again, they're trying to make a very slick, fast-paced Hollywood movie that's less than 2 hours long. I get it. But there's a very interesting story about Mena during the time period that Barry Seal was operating there, where there were 2 teenage boys from Mena who died very mysteriously, either on or near the area that was used for drug smuggling and training Contras and so on. And as a matter of fact, of all things, Unsolved Mysteries actually did, I believe, 2 episodes on this story. I think they were both during season 1 of Unsolved Mysteries. Definitely one of them was during season 1. I think the other one was 2. And basically what happened was you have these 2 local teenage boys who'd gone out supposedly hunting at night, which I don't know about Arkansas, but in most places that's illegal. But anyway, teenage boys, these 2 buddies, they go out hunting at night, and eventually they don't come home, and their dead bodies are found on train tracks near Mina. And, they'd been run over by a train, but then the question is, were they already, dead or severely injured and then placed on those train tracks, or did they somehow decide to lay down on the train tracks? And the interesting thing is that the initial ruling is that these are accidental deaths. And the story is, because of course you'd ask yourself, like, who in the heck would go just lay down and take a nap on train tracks? That seems kind of insane. But the story was that the boys had been smoking the pot and had gotten so stoned that they didn't know which way was up, and they both happened to pass out in a stone stupor right on the train tracks, and then the train came and ran them over, and it's just a tragic accident. But the boys' parents apparently didn't believe that story and kind of hired, I think, private investigators and did their best to get the thing looked at again, and showed a lot of holes in that story. And basically what they dug up seemed to point towards these 2 boys were killed because they saw something they weren't supposed to see. Who knows what that might have been? Did they witness some kind of like a big drug deal happening? Did they witness Contras doing military training? Did they witness something else? Who knows? But anyway, that gives you a kind of a sense that there was this sunny side to the operation in Mina, where there is all this money coming into this town, and I'm sure a lot of locals did benefit from Seal bringing in all this money. But on the other hand, there's this story, and who knows, if Seal himself knew about, if these 2 boys were in fact murdered, did Seal himself have anything to do with it or know anything about it? Who knows? But, there's enough there that it certainly looks very suspicious.
These are really the things that when I find them out, because I'm of a certain age where these things were happening in my childhood. And when you see these sorts of events turning into history and you start learning what really happened, it really blows your mind.
Yeah, I agree. And, I was watching Unsolved Mysteries as a kid. I probably saw this episode and, didn't really think much of it. Just like, in the 80s, there was a lot of, first off, it seems like in the 80s, kids got killed a lot more often, like murdered a lot more often than they do these days. It seemed like I grew up in South Florida, and I was too young. I think I was just a baby when Adam Walsh's kid got murdered. And then, inspired Adam Walsh to make America's Most Wanted. But, even growing up in the years after that happened, like, people were still talking about it. And I probably saw this episode of Unsolved Mysteries at some point, and I just sort of saw it as, oh, look, another case where kids probably got murdered. It's kind of how the 80s are.
Yeah.
And even the drug smuggling angle, I can't remember, but I don't think in that episode, because I rewatched it not too long ago. Unsolved Mysteries is now on Amazon Prime. If anybody wants to look this up, I don't think they ever mention the name Barry Seal, but they do kind of say that, oh, there was some kind of drug operation in Mina, so that might have something to do with it. But it's just interesting how, you go back, like you were saying, all these things that were kind of happening around us when we were growing up, and you sort of get the surface story of it through the media. But then to go back and start digging into it and go, oh, look, here's these dots you can connect. You can connect Iran-Contra to this episode of Unsolved Mysteries where 2 kids die mysteriously in rural Arkansas. It's the kind of stuff that I'm really into, the kind of stuff I'm always interested to dig into.
What sort of, now that we're at this part of the movie, what sort of operation did SEALs have? We talked a little bit that there was some CIA training going on there, and obviously this town is getting really, really wealthy. What else? What was SEALs doing transporting these drugs from Colombia to the United States and then getting information on for the Contras against the Sandinistas? What was happening during this section of his career?
Yeah, well, he was basically working for a bunch of different people and groups at once. And this is part of what for a while made him so rich. And I mean, he's just making ridiculous amounts of money, as the film shows, like literally more money than he knew what to do with. But then also what eventually got him killed when things turned south for him. But the simple version is that more or less the overall bird's eye view that the film depicts seems to have been correct, where he's involved in flying drugs into the U.S. and also with transporting drugs to Nicaragua to then be brought into the U.S. by boat, that he was involved also with running guns into Latin America, and ostensibly mostly for the Contras, but like the film shows, seems like he probably also was funneling some of them to the actual cartels so that the cartels could have really good firepower. So there's that. The connection to Noriega and Panama as sort of like a money laundering hub, that's basically true. And then the fact that they eventually did start bringing at least some of the Contras into the U.S. to train at Mina is also correct. So there's this whole thing of drugs coming into the U.S., arms going into Latin America, and then also, the money flowing various places, and the Contras eventually, some of them being brought into the States temporarily to train. So, when you zoom in on the details, it starts to get more and more messy. It's very interesting, too, that there was more of a connection to Florida in all this stuff than the movie depicted. Again, movie possibly just to kind of simplify things a little bit. But there was more of a connection to Florida as well, where if you look into, first off, a fair amount of the drugs was coming into Florida, not just into Louisiana, but also in terms of like a lot of the money laundering was happening also through Miami banks, or in some cases, Latin American banks that had, some amount of operation in Miami. So if someone watches something like the documentary Cocaine Cowboys, you can see some of this at work as well. And I'm not saying SEAL was involved with all of this stuff. I'm not saying that every single, operation of running coke into the eastern U.S. had SEAL's involvement directly in it, but that it's kind of all, to some degree, connected in a way. And you see similar sorts of operations happening as far as certain people are able to get political protection that allows them to be a lot more successful at smuggling than they otherwise would be. And this is, again, all being done at the same time that there's a lot of right-wing politicians who get elected in part on, I'm going to be tough on crime and tough on drugs and all that. So, there's, of course, part of the side effect of cracking down harder on the war on drugs is it will often tend to drive, it never makes the drugs go away, but what it often does, it will drive the price of the drugs up. So you can imagine from the perspective of the CIA and Oliver North and these people who are trying to, in part, use the drug trade to fund the Contras, then this side effect of the war on drugs would look very positive as far as it makes the drugs more profitable.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. They portray in the movie that SEAL's career, basically, he drops off of the edge of the cliff. He gets busted. Then he really has one last chance to get himself out of this through working with Oliver North and the CIA in that way. Is that accurate to the way it was portrayed in the movie, especially how SEAL is basically let off the hook by the then governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, which the movie doesn't exactly say, but it's inferred that Bill Clinton was the one who gets him out of trouble.
Right. Yeah. He's busted by that female attorney general who's really out to get him. And then she gets a phone call from Governor Clinton. And then after this phone call, she basically lets SEAL go. Now, my understanding is that there is reason to believe that Bill Clinton, at least to some degree, knew some of what was going on in Mina, had some notion of it, and that he did to some degree try to, not sick the state law enforcement heavily on him or anything like that. The story I've come across is that there may have been a case where Clinton basically helped SEAL get off for a bust, and that it happened earlier than was depicted in the movie, and that it was while Bill Clinton was still Attorney General of Arkansas that he kind of helped SEAL get off the hook. And presumably, if that's true, it's probably because Clinton was getting pressure from, further up at the federal level to kind of, let this guy off the hook. But there's the scene where he does get let off the hook in Arkansas, but then he kind of gets grabbed by guys that never says who they are. Maybe they're CIA, maybe they're who knows what. And he gets, actually, taken literally all the way to Washington, D.C., where he actually goes to the White House. And that's where he gets coercively recruited by North and also with DEA involvement to conduct this sting, not only against the Medellin cartel, but also his job is to try and make it look like the Sandinistas are involved with smuggling the drugs, which, I mean, it's hilariously ironic that, the CIA is actually helping with sort of the Contras or more right-wing types involved with the drug trade. And meanwhile, the Reagan administration, the guys involved with this clandestine stuff, they then want to pin the blame for the cocaine trade on the Sandinistas. Now, some deal like that happened, but as far as I know, Seal never was actually brought literally to the White House physically to meet with these people. He seems to have probably met with Oliver North, perhaps on multiple occasions, but not in the White House, not in D.C., but, down maybe in Louisiana or Arkansas or someplace like that. And so that overall scene is inaccurate. There's the scene where he briefly chats with a young George W. Bush, which is a hilarious scene, but I don't think that happened that way. But instead, what really got Seal recruited into this sting was actually, I might have mentioned it earlier, he got busted for smuggling Quaaludes into Florida. And that was what ultimately then he turned informant in order to get off the hook for that. And then he did do this thing where his main plane, I think it was a C-123, they installed secret cameras on it, and then his job was to go on a drug run and then get pictures of the cartel guys, and then also try to get pictures that implicate the Sandinistas. And the problem is, at least based on what I've been able to dig up, the Sandinistas weren't really involved in drug smuggling. There's not much evidence to indicate that at all. It was just the Reagan administration wanted to, tar them with that. But they apparently got some photos where one guy who was some sort of official in the Sandinista government was on camera. But then from what I found, it's really shady how much that guy was really a Sandinista, because he had connections to some of the Contra people. So, he apparently did have some sort of job in the Sandinista government, but was he also kind of a double agent for the CIA and the Contras? It looks very questionable. And that's kind of all they ever got, as far as I know, of evidence that the Sandinista government was involved in cocaine dealing, is some pictures of this one guy helping to load cocaine, or at least present there. But it is true that his participation in this sting is what got Seal exposed as an informer to the world, including the cartel, and what may have been, one of the main causes of him ultimately getting killed. And the film depicts it as Ronald Reagan giving a TV speech and then showing this picture that shows Seal and the cartel guys and everything, loading cocaine into his plane. And in reality, it actually was exposed earlier by a newspaper article. I'm trying to remember, it might have been Washington Post, but I forget. Somebody actually in a newspaper article had gotten leaked the information about Seal's sting, trying to implicate the cartel and the Sandinistas as working together. And this is what first outed Barry Seal's involvement with the DEA and trying to bust these people. So then the question is, who actually made the leak? If it wasn't, the president on TV that first broke this story and exposed Seal, then who made the leak? And we don't know for sure, but people who have done a lot more research into this than I have, and who have written books about certain aspects of this story, they basically say, a lot of them, that there's good reason to think it was Oliver North himself who leaked this to the press, because he wanted to, tar and feather the Sandinistas, and either didn't care what it would mean for Barry Seal getting exposed, or perhaps maybe for one reason or another, at that point, he kind of wanted to burn Barry Seal. So that the thought is that either it's just, oops, an accident, or that they wanted to close the loop on Barry Seal, so to speak. Yeah. For one reason or another, maybe they decided he was no longer useful, and so they threw him under the bus. Maybe there was something else going on. Maybe he had, he knew too much and they no longer trusted him to keep it to themselves. Or maybe it was just sheer, incompetence, don't care, right? What ultimately happens to Barry Seal then? Well, he apparently starts to lose a lot of his protection. The film depicts Schaefer at the CIA basically ordering everyone working for him to destroy all records of Barry Seal. I don't know for sure if something like that happened, although it wouldn't surprise me. But he does kind of seem to get thrown under the bus by the CIA, so they're no longer going to keep, protecting him from law enforcement. And then law enforcement does bust him, and then a weird thing happens where he does get indicted, I believe, in federal court. And the movie shows this all happening in Louisiana, but I think it might have happened in another state. Not that that's a hugely important detail, but basically he does get busted, and he no longer has either the CIA or the feds in general protecting him. But what's really weird is he gets busted, and then he, of all things, he gets released, and he gets sentenced to community service. It's a very, very weird thing. They sentence him to community service. I forget, 1,000 hours or something of community service at a Salvation Army in Louisiana. And he asked for protection. He, not unreasonably given the fact that by this point he was basically a marked man. He wanted protection. He wanted some sort of protective custody. And the judge who gave him this community service refused to authorize any kind of real bodyguarding or anything for him. And so it is basically true that what happened was the last few weeks or months, I forget how long he was actually doing it, but the last bit of his life, Barry Seal was, as the movie showed, living in hotels and going to the Salvation Army every day to do community service. And then, he was doing this for a while, and eventually one of the days, I think it happened when he was leaving the Salvation Army at the end of the day, he gets in his car and he's getting ready to go, and some hitmen walk up and gun him down. And, everybody says the official story anyway is that these are people, hired by the cartel, by Ochoa and Escobar and so on. And there have been some other things floated, other theories that it may have been somebody else. It may have been perhaps like a CIA connected hit team or something. I don't know. But the way I see it is, even if the people who actually gunned him down were working for the Medellin cartel, in a way, to some extent, the various federal people who put him in the situation were at least somewhat complicit, again, either through kind of accident and incompetence or deliberately exposing him to danger. But, they had kind of burned him by that point, and it does look a little suspicious that the judge sentenced him to do community service at a Salvation Army in Louisiana for, major drug charges and whatever. And that would be the sentence, not even any prison time. And also that they would refuse to offer him any sort of protection when he clearly, to anyone paying attention by that point, was a marked man.
In the end, what do you think about this movie, and how do you think that this time in history, which it's not that long ago, we're talking about 30 years, do you think this is history now, or are we still too close to the facts of Iran-Contra and the Medellin cartel and all the war on drugs? Are we too close to it to really assess what happened in the mid-'80s?
I think we're starting to have enough perspective now, and that enough things that were secret and hidden at the time have started to come out that we can kind of piece it together. And so I think part of why things have been coming out in recent years, like this movie and the movie Kill the Messenger about Gary Webb and that whole side of this story, is that the story has been exposed long enough that it's kind of in the popular mind, and that we certainly don't have all the evidence, and we probably never will, because so much of this stuff, when you're talking about a clandestine agency like the CIA, and then you're also talking about criminal organizations like drug cartels, These groups, one thing they definitely have in common, of potentially many things, is that they're very secretive. And in general, they're pretty good at keeping secrets. So, they often don't leave a blatant paper trail of a lot of important things. And of course, dead men tell no tales, right? And Barry Seal was killed in 1986. A lot of other people involved with this thing have died, either, natural causes or something more suspicious. And over time, these things start to, on the one hand, things get exposed, but on the other hand, other things start to disappear. People die who knew things. What records might have actually existed get either deliberately or accidentally lost to history. So, yeah, on the one hand, I think we're getting enough perspective that we can look at this honestly. And on the other hand, unfortunately, they're kind of like with things like the JFK assassination and other, shady chapters in our history, there's probably going to remain a certain amount of things that we'll just never know.
As you said, we're starting to see more movies and more popular culture of this time period. Narcos, this movie, a few other movies. Is there a particular aspect of this aspect of history and this time period that you would like to see done in a movie or a television series?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I guess if it was up to me, and I don't know if you'd be able to make a Hollywood movie that would be able to pull this off within that format. Maybe you would need something more along the lines of a series or a miniseries. Maybe even something more like the recent Netflix series Wormwood about MK Ultra that kind of combines dramatic recreation of events with more of a documentary style. It kind of goes back and forth between those two. Maybe it would take something like this, but I would like to see something that connects a lot of the dots going further back, because the way that we're given in something like American Made, the story is like, oh, this thing just kind of popped into existence in the late 70s. And for, maybe a decade or so, you had the Iran-Contra operation happening until it got exposed. And it doesn't really flesh out the deep roots and the connections of people and groups of people going further back to other shady things. So it kind of serves up this stuff a la carte. And I would like to see something where it connects some of this stuff going further back into the 60s and even the 50s. Because like I said before, they gloss over Seal's time in the Civil Air Patrol, which he joined as in his, I think, early teens. And he was in a Civil Air Patrol unit in Louisiana in the 50s that was full of all sorts of weird characters who are connected to all kinds of shady things. That Civil Air Patrol unit was led by David Ferry, who's the historical character portrayed by Joe Pesci in the film JFK. Obviously, a very, very interesting and historically plugged-in guy. He also, when Seal was in the Civil Air Patrol, also in his unit was a cadet named Lee Harvey Oswald. Kind of a weird chance encounter, I guess. There are stories that Seal may have been involved with the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. And for sure, we know that he was around a lot of people who were involved in that stuff. David Ferry, E. Howard Hunt, all these big names in this dark nook of American history. The film never mentions that Barry Seal served with what's called the 20th Special Forces Reserve Group while he was in the Louisiana National Guard, which that's never, I don't think, mentioned in the film in any way. They briefly mentioned Civil Air Patrol, but not that. Barry Seal, it's a weird thing. If you look up the 20th Special Forces Group, it's a reserve Special Forces Group, which right off the bat is kind of weird. And Seal was with them, never actually went all the way through Special Forces school and became a Green Beret, but he was with them for years. And I think as an engineer and a pilot and that sort of thing. So he's got all these connections to people who are connected to the Bay of Pigs, to people who are connected with a bunch of the plots to kill Castro, connected to some of the variations of the JFK conspiracy theories. And so I bring all that up just to kind of illustrate that a lot of times And this again, raises the question of how many of these things are some form of a limited hangout, where a lot of times when these things do get depicted in a popular movie or in a TV show, they serve you up some interesting, juicy stuff. To someone who doesn't know any of this clandestine history, they go, "Oh my gosh, this guy, he's getting let off the hook by Bill Clinton, and he's getting helped out by the by Oliver North and the office of George H.W. Bush and all this." And yeah, that's a big deal if you've never heard that stuff. But then you don't get as much of a sense of like these things don't pop into existence all of a sudden, that there's deep roots to these sorts of operations and these sorts of relationships. And by the way, just one more thing that I've encountered in multiple sources that raises the question of how deep this stuff goes. I've seen it put in certain sources that Barry Seal had the phone number to Vice President George H.W. Bush's, like his private line direct to his office. And supposedly he had this phone number on a piece of paper in his pocket when he was killed. And also I heard an interview somewhere, I can't remember where, with Barry Seal's lawyer, where Barry Seal's lawyer said that, oh yeah, he had George H.W. Bush's private office phone number. So, again, is this a limited hangout? Does this stuff actually go deeper even than the film depicts?
I like how you put it there. All of these events in the Cold War, even right now in my mind's eye, are little islands of events. There's an event here, an event here. And we're just starting to see now that there's filaments that are attaching all of these events together. And we're just starting to learn more and more about it. And I think that that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, these people, they have long careers, whether they're like Seal, where they're kind of, not officially on the government's payroll and they're doing, illegal stuff, but in part on behalf of the government, or whether they're people who are officially working for the government, like Oliver North or George H.W. Bush, or who knows what. If someone's not familiar with a lot of the shady history of George H.W. Bush, you can check out the book Family of Secrets by Russ Baker. It'll give you some of that stuff. And these people, they have long careers that oftentimes span decades. And they meet and associate with and, befriend and do business with other important characters of this sort. And so, there's always more history than meets the eye, whether it's some general or some CIA guy. If you can trace their career back somewhat and say, oh, what's this guy done before? You oftentimes find some really interesting stuff.
Do you think now in 2018, we're 3 decades away from the fall of the Soviet Union, the official end of the Cold War? Are we past this time in history, or are there still things, reverberations from the Cold War that we're still dealing with today?
Oh, I think absolutely. And at least in my opinion, it's unfortunate that we didn't kind of escape the Cold War legacy more than we have. But if you look at our military and intelligence apparatus, the institutional framework, and yeah, it's been enlarged since 9/11, but it's still based on the Cold War scaffolding that was put in place all the way back in the late 40s, as far as the CIA, the NSA, the way the military is organized, and the way the military, the types of things they train for and prepare for. To a large extent, it's still basically the Cold War model in place today. And I just recently on my show was talking to a veteran of the Iraq War, and he was telling me that back in, I don't know, I think he said it's 2005, 6, something like that, he was going through training in the Army to eventually be shipped over to Iraq. And what he was being trained on were Cold War tactics, including things like bayonet charges, which, is even a bit older than the Cold War, but things also like, all right, we're going to prepare to fight Soviet tanks, mano-a-mano, tank to tank. And obviously things that have little relevance to the sorts of wars the United States has been engaged in lately. And I think the Cold War, it also gave America kind of a tragic national mindset in the sense of paranoia, oftentimes not justified in my opinion, and a sense of like a Manichaean worldview of the world is broken into good guys and bad guys. And then also a sense that anything that you have to do to fight the forces of evil is justified, even if it's something that's illegal, even if it's something that's unconstitutional, even if it's something that normally you would consider horribly immoral. But if it's in the name of that greater good of fighting the forces of darkness, it's justified. And I think that's what you see here in American Made and in this history of the Iran-Contra affair, where two people like Oliver North, potentially George H.W. Bush, other members of the Reagan administration, they were so fixated on we've got to oppose communism that they were willing to do all of these shady and illegal things, sponsor death squads in El Salvador, all kinds of stuff. But they saw it as, oh, it's justified in order to resist communism. And I think even though the communists went away, we still have that mindset today. A lot of how we view the so-called war on terror is still through that kind of Cold War Manichaean us versus them prism. And I think that also these days you look at it, there's a lot of people in the U.S. government who seem to be trying very hard to reignite a Cold War with Russia. And a lot of these people, if you look at them, they're in their 60s or 70s. They're people who were born and raised in the Cold War, in the heart of the Cold War. And to some extent, I don't think that they ever readjusted their worldview or their mindset when the Iron Curtain fell.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I think in an hour, a little over an hour, we jammed a lot of story into here, and there's still probably a lot more to talk about.
Yeah, there is. You know, the toughest part for me in preparing to talk with you about this movie was I dug up so much, and it was a matter of trying to whittle it down so that it would fit into a modest-sized conversation. But yeah, there are, books and articles and all kinds of stuff out there that really get into way more than I've even brought up here.
I want to thank everybody again for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Prof. CJ of the Dangerous History podcast for joining us. Links to learn more about CJ and his great show can be found at profcj.org or in the show notes. I really highly recommend this show. If you want a really different and eye-opening perspective on many of the topics of history, some of them are just mind-blowing. It's like, how did I not know this? This show is definitely for you. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think about the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. And of course, I will see you next time Beyond the Big Screen.